We're in Mark chapter 15. And we have been studying the various phases of the cruelty and the mockery and the difficulties that first the Jews and then ultimately in the hands of Pilate and the Romans that they put our Savior through. It's been for me, in a lot of ways, been a very emotional study. As I've looked at these things and I've found myself just on almost a personal roller coaster with it. There are times where I'm saddened because of the sins that sent Jesus to the cross to begin with, which include mine. And a recognition of all the misery and suffering and shame that Jesus is experiencing, I'm just as responsible for the need for it. And though I may not have shouted crucify, though I may not have led Him into the hands of the high priest, and I may not have sat in the audience desiring for Him to be put to death while Barabbas was released. But it was my sins that sent Him to the cross. And so there's a heaviness that comes when you see these descriptions of what Jesus encountered and went through on our behalf because of sin. I'll be honest with you, there's a level of anger that I feel when I read these texts. To think of the human cruelty and to even try to fathom how even if they genuinely believed He was a threat, the amount of cruel actions perpetrated against Him are just mind-boggling. That they saw Him as less than human in some way. That in some form or fashion, whether mob mentality, group mentality, or whatever it was that was motivating it, it's amazing to think about how the different various groups, whether it be initially with the Jews and their mockery and shame that they put Him through, or then the Romans. It's just very sad and to see how they treated another human being, let alone what they thought of Him in relationship to the claims and teachings that he had brought. One of the things I wanted to mention to you that I did not bring up in our prior study is that the initial place that Mark records for us is that they lead Him from the garden and take Him where? To whom? To the high priest, right? They take Him to the high priest of the Jews, first to the high priest of the Jews, and then ultimately to Pilate. The interesting aspect about that, if you read John's account, you find that there are actually how many so-called, in some senses, high priests? There are two, right? There's an older man by the name of Annas, and he is the legit high priest of the Jews. He is the one that was chosen and put into that purpose through the Jewish system. He is the one technically that is responsible. The problem was Rome didn't like it. As best I can read and study about it and figure the reasons out as to why there were two, the best understanding that I could come to is that Rome did not care for him, and so they appointed Caiaphas, who, depending on which how you kind of sort some of that out, but he's referred to in John's account as the son-in-law, where he refers to Caiaphas as the father-in-law to Caiaphas. And so there's a family connection, and there's some secular history that you can look at in relationship to that. But there's a family connection, and Caiaphas has kind of been placed in charge, and he's the one, if you're going to involve the Romans, he's got to be involved, because he's the one they listen to. He's the one that has connection to the Roman authorities, because he's the one they have placed in a position of power. Now, Mark doesn't even mention that. He just mentions that he goes to the high priest. John records that he goes to Annas first, and then he says, okay, I've seen him, now off to Caiaphas. And the process begins. It's Caiaphas, by the way, that is the one in John's record, again, that notes that he makes the statement that one should die for the people. It's an interesting angle about him, and there's not a lot of detail given about what motivates that, but you can kind of see what his implication is that he saw the Jewish people starting to be divided over the influence of Jesus. He began to see the downfall of the Jewish system, and though he may have thought Jesus as being innocent, though he may have thought of Jesus as even being able to fulfill these things and works and wonders that he had done, Caiaphas determines that it's better for one man to die, even if innocent, than for the entire Jewish system to collapse because of him. And so he's an interesting character that kind of joins us. Now, I believe when we get to Mark's record and he says that these things happened at the high priest, and I think we're already to Caiaphas at this point. We're already to him by the time Mark begins to talk about it. And so he doesn't record for us the other high priest involved. I believe we're already at Caiaphas when they came and brought Jesus there and all of that incident. And again, there's not always a full record in everyone's account. You add John's account, you learn also the reason why Peter was able to get close enough to be able to see Jesus was actually because of whom? Because of John himself. Right? John had a relationship with the high priest that gave him some access to actually be with Jesus through a period of time. John comes out, knows Peter has followed afar off, and he goes to the doorkeeper and basically gets Peter some access that he hadn't had. That's when the initial denial occurs. When you read John's account, you see Peter come, and when they see him come to the door, that's the first challenge they make against him, and that's the first denial that he makes. And then you see some other narrative, and it comes back to the other denials of Jesus before that all ends. And so it's hard sometimes to kind of piece all of the gospel accounts together and kind of see a seamless approach towards each event. But I did want to at least talk about the fact that you had two different men serving as high priest in that time period. One through the Jewish system, the other through the Romans, and he's the one who's got the clout with the Romans to be able to deal with this circumstance and ultimately sends him into the hands of Pilate to be dealt with. So when that occurs, and we studied that on Sunday morning, and we noted, and I showed you a form of a crown of thorns as they put purple on him there in verse 17, and they played a crown of thorns and put it about his head. And then what do they begin to do? Okay, so first they begin to what? Verse 18. Begin to salute him. Hail, King of the Jews, right? It's an open shame that they're beginning to put him through. You claim to be a great king. You claim to be so honorable. And so, let's give you a purple robe because that's what kings wear. And, you need a crown. And so they fashion one out of thorns and place it upon his head. And then they begin to salute him and say, Hail, King of the Jews. But then their mockery goes even to a greater, crueler state. They smote him on the head with a reed and did spit upon him. That's happened now twice, right? It happens when he's with the Jews, and it happens now again when he's with the Romans. To think that they would consider it okay. And it makes you wonder a little bit. In my study this afternoon, I thought a little bit about the fact that we don't know a lot about what these two thieves that are crucified with him went through as their led to their crucifixion. You wonder, are all of them being put to the same open shame? Certainly Jesus is. And they've hit him on the head with a reed, and then they spit upon him. And then after they've done that, then they bow down. But you're a king. And so they fall to their knees and begin to worship him. And when they had mocked him, they took off the purple from him, put his own clothes on him, and led him out to crucify. I'm amazed that it wasn't satisfactory enough for them to just take him and crucify him. And again, I wondered, that seems to be the imagery with the thieves, that they just end up going to be crucified for the crimes that they had committed. But with Jesus, they've taken a morbid pleasure in putting him through the open shame that Isaiah in particular prophesied would happen to him. And they mock and they scoff. And you can almost hear the cruel laughter among the soldiers as they drop to their knees and fake worshiping him. And have no guilt whatsoever as they strike him with the reed or spit upon him. And then when they're done with their fun in their minds, When they've mocked and shamed him enough, now, okay, let's take the robe, the purple, off of him, and let's put him back in his own clothes, and then let's send him off to be crucified.
Don't you find it amazing that they have to pass him around 3 times in their trials, religious trials, and they send him to Pilate, Pilate sends him to Herod, Herod sends him back to Pilate. They can't make a decision. They have to come up with some kind of a false accusation before they can do anything.
Yeah. And ultimately all of that, first to Annas, then to Caiaphas, then to Pilate, then to Herod, back to Pilate. And all of this, and ultimately a crucifixion, happens solely on the fact that Caiaphas, I believe, says that's blasphemy when he talks about his connection to God. That's blasphemy. And Pilate's unwillingness to send an innocent man free. Those are the two things that his entire court case is about. The unwillingness of a Roman governor to acknowledge the truth of a situation and deal with it appropriately. But I mean, and then this, to have gone through that all night long, right? One to the next, to the next, to the next, to the next, and then put to this.
He knew that for envy they had liberty, so he knew all the time the man was innocent.
Right. And to Pilate's knowledge, envy was not a transgression of Jewish law or any other law, right? Of things that they could accuse him of.
Just add what Andy said and what we kind of discussed Sunday morning, there were so many evidences before Pilate that Jesus was innocent that there was no doubt in his mind. We talked about that. When you read all 4 accounts combined, as much as he was unwilling to release Jesus, the fact is Pilate didn't want to crucify him. He didn't want to do that. He didn't. And getting back to the text for it now, though, I did have a little bit of a question with the Romans, especially the Roman soldiers who were given the detail of the scourging and the crucifixion. They were given the orders, if you will. You know, this is the 5 or 6 or 8 soldiers that are going to carry this out. Do you think that there was any? I don't know that there was any special animosity or hatred that they had necessarily against Jesus, as much as when you were a Roman soldier for 15 or 20 years, that was a hard life. You saw a lot of things. And it just made you, for lack of a better word, insensitive to anything that happened around you. You didn't care. I mean, on the battlefield, whatever you were told, this is the enemy.
It's hard. Motive is the hardest part to understand in relationship to them. But even if hardened by the light, you would hope that they would never reach the point where they would do that which is inhumane. And that's where it seems like they've gone even beyond even what might be a hardened man would do.
So Pilate was basing the whole thing on what the chief priest told him, right?
Well, in essence, truthfully, no. He's basing it on the fact that if he's this mob out in front of his court, he's done as a ruler. And so he doesn't believe any of what they're saying. I don't think Pilate has any real conviction about anything that they've accused Jesus of. All he knows is if I don't put him to death like this mob wants, then I'm out of a job, and he relents because of that.
Not much has changed in 2,000 years. Politicians, and Pilate was a politician. He willingly to content the people.
The political what's best for me first has not changed. Yeah, it hasn't changed a lot. And the truth is, and I thought a little bit about this when I was studying this afternoon as well, human cruelty hasn't changed either. You see it prior to the times of Jesus. You see it with Jesus. You've seen it in history after Jesus, where men reach such a misinformed, a mismotive, whatever the reasoning, which is mind-boggling to begin with. But to treat others as though they're less than human is something that has been around for a long time.
Jews had 40 lashes and saved one due to miscount. The Romans did not have that number. They could flog a person as many times as they wanted to. And many times the victim did not make it to the cross. They died during the flogging. So like what John was asking, maybe they had a little bit of compassion, or maybe they God's will brought it about that he was going to be on the tree.
Right. There's lots of historical kind of things you can read about some of those things. Obviously, if you want to hasten the death that comes by crucifixion, if you weaken the body with the scourging prior to that, it's not nearly as doesn't take nearly as long then to bring death. And I don't mean to be morbid here, but I'm just trying to it doesn't. And so the scourging precipitates, and you're right, the brutality of that itself. And it's interesting. Mark's kind of concise approach to this is kind of interesting because he basically says Pilate just kind of throws up his hands in a sense when he can't figure out why they wanted Barabbas released back unto him and crucify Jesus. But then the next moment, Mark just simply says, Pilate, sent him to be scourged, just like it was. All right, that's where we're heading.
Pilate had something else that was directly affecting the decisions. His wife said, "Have nothing to do with that, this man. I've suffered much in a dream this night because of it." So that had to be on his mind.
It's amazing that he makes his decisions despite every single piece of information and knowledge that's put before him, and he still makes the decision that he makes. Good, Ron. Yeah, and it's back to kind of what Brian was talking about a minute ago. His job as governor was first and foremost in his mind over anything else that was happening in front of him.
You're right, he could have lost it.
Yeah. You get an uproar in your hands.
I remember I read somewhere, not scripture, but I guess he was already on edge with the emperor.
Yeah.
And I've read some things. There are legends that I guess Pilate. One account is later on, like the guilt caught him to him, and there's one account. There's one secular writing that said he killed himself. I don't know if there's any validity to it, but it's just.
No doubt, there's enough historical. I think there's enough historical evidence to realize that he is on the outs with Roman rule, and he can't afford a problem. And keep in mind, he's governing over a region that's got insurrections and challenges against Rome constantly because there's a bunch of zealots there that don't like the fact that Rome's ruling in Judea. And so whoever's going to be the governor there is going to have to continually deal with that over and over again.
Brian, the last scripture you read, 20, where it says they put his own clothes back on.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know enough about the history, but is there something there that when they crucify him, that they strip him down to more or less a cloth? Because we know that wasn't his clothing.
Right. Ultimately, they will. Eventually, you'll get to a point where they take his clothing, they kind of just parcel it out, and then they cast lots for that seamless outer garment that he had. And so it seems as though they and obviously they would do that for the scourging. He would be stripped down for that, which happened right after Pilate sends him. Then the robe, the crown, the mockery, then all of that back, and then here's your clothes, and then they'll do that again, seemingly in the line of chronology. They'll take it from him again. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I have always had trouble understanding, and since I became a parent, it's even harder. I understand that from the beginning, God's plan was that Jesus had to die for our sins. But instead of going through all of this, if he would have died quickly, would that still not have been for our sins?
But again, I don't know. You know what I mean? All I can tell you is what we know. And we don't have any idea of knowing. We can understand why God chose blood sacrifice. I think you can kind of see that historically unfold biblically. But as far as why couldn't it have been quicker? Why couldn't it have been easier? Why couldn't it? Go ahead, John.
I would say the only, I guess, probable explanation that I've ever thought of is it gives us a picture of how terrible sin is. That this is what sin caused. You know, you see the horrific nature of sin and what it cost. And it kind of gives us a picture of, if that's what sin does, why would I ever want to be?
Yeah, this is what it looks like. And I'll come back to that, Mary, actually one more time before we're done. Not that I can give you a precise answer to your question, but I want to talk about one other thing when I get to it here in the text.
You know, it makes me think how much love God has for us, His Son has for us, to go through all this treatment. If it was just a quick death, he can down, family's on, right back. But He had to suffer and suffer and suffer.
Yeah.
It just shows how great a love that He has for His creation.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Couple thoughts, if you don't mind. Why did He have to suffer? Because during all of this was the fulfillment of prophecy. If He hadn't went through what He went through, the prophecies would not have been fulfilled. Another thing too is a battle between God and Satan. It was God's will that Jesus died in this manner. And although many times we look at it and say, oh, that's so wrong, that's what God's will was. And Jesus knew that, and He accepted that. Although He prayed, if any other way possible, let's do this. But like the wife that came out of Pilate who said, he's a righteous man, don't have anything, to do with this. That was actually Satan's influence, because if this trial could have been declared a mistrial or anything else like that, then Satan would have won and Jesus would not have died at that time. But the thing is, He fulfilled so much prophecy.
Yeah. Though it's hard for us to grasp, why would God have chosen that? I think that's kind of the deeper question. Why would God have chosen that? We can certainly, though, do appreciate the fact that what He did choose had been prophesied about, and Jesus fulfills all of those things that relates to that. And He's going to follow that course. And again, I'm going to talk about that here in verse 23 here in just a minute. So on the trip out to crucify Him, they compel one Simon, a Cyrenian, who passed by coming out of the country, the father of Alexander and Rufus, to bear his cross. So one of the responsibilities of one who was going to be crucified was to basically carry the weapon of your death to your death. And on the way, though, Jesus has become so weakened by everything that has occurred and the carrying of the cross that they compel this Simon, the Cyrene, to carry or bear that cross. And by the way, these Roman soldiers had a right to do that. They could basically walk up to anybody and say, you're doing this, and they don't really have any choice in the matter. Now, what's interesting about this to me is, notice He didn't just say a fellow by the name of Simon, did He? He said, Simon, a Cyrenian who passed by coming out of the country, the father of Alexander and Rufus, to bear his cross. I'm convinced that those kinds of moments are historical backdrops, especially for the more contemporaries. When these first gospel accounts would begin to start being written, and they would begin to get into the hands of the people from this region, there would be people who most likely would have been able to remember a guy by the name of Simon the Cyrenian, who had two sons by the name of Alexander and Rufus. And you make a historical connection. We do that all the time with people, right? We say, well, this was his dad, or this was his grandmother, and her sister, and we connect things historically based on people. That's what He's doing, I believe, by recording Simon's name and some specifics about him for us. He's establishing a historical background that can be relied upon as these accounts of the gospel put forward. And so Simon's been chosen. Whether you're interested in this or not, I'll give you a quick snippet and then you can ask the question. There are two schools of thought as to carrying or bearing the cross. There are some who contend that the location for crucifixion would have been already established, and so the vertical posts would have been already there, and so the necessity would only be to carry the cross beam to the cross. And that is historically accurate, by the way, in almost every Roman province except Judea. All historical evidence goes to show that in Judea that was not the case. Because of the Jewish laws as it pertains to coming in contact with blood and coming in contact with thank you. I didn't want to say it, but thank you for saying it. I couldn't find the polite way to say that. So they did not. All indications show that they did not do that in Judea. That this would have been the full instrument of his death. That he's carrying and dragging. Then Simon has to pick up and carry. Now, none of us are really going to know for sure on that. There's not enough historical. There's circumstantial historical evidences to show that parts of Roman provinces had places already established, and here were the vertical posts already there, and so there's evidence of that. But there's also plenty of evidence to illustrate that they were not doing that in Judea when it came to crucifixion. So, be that as it may, either way, you're bearing a heavy load, a major burden, and to think that they're making you carry the very thing that they're going to put you to death on. And so, in your last moments, I think about. I don't want to over compare, but you think about the scenes that we have in modern capital punishment cases where they're given what? They're given the choice of whatever they want to eat for dinner, and they're given comforts. They're given all these comforts leading up to what are generally considered then a humane way. Not so here. Completely to the contrary. You have been battered and beaten, mocked, shamed, spit upon, broken. And now carry your cross to your own death. That's the imagery. And that's the heavy burden that's being borne by our Savior in this moment. And so on the way, they bring him unto the place Golgotha, which is being interpreted the place of a skull. Sometimes you'll see the word Calvary, same word, just in Latin. I believe Calvary comes from the Latin. Golgotha has some Hebrew and Aramaic connections. But what's nice about it is he just interprets what it means, what it meant to them. And they use that term to call it the place of a skull. I've read a lot about why did they call it the place of a skull. Some contend, well, that's because that's where they crucified anybody they were going to crucify. You see that written by some. I heard one conjecture that that's where, when you recall, when David takes down Goliath, what did he do with him? He took his head, right? And there are some who claim this is the point in which he took and displayed for Jerusalem that he had reigned victorious over Goliath. Again, you'd have to go completely out of biblical references to be able to even figure that out as to where that exact works. The truth of the matter is the most probable to me is because there are regions in and around Jerusalem who have hillsides like this that look like a skull from the stones on the outside. And so most likely that's the reason why they were calling this place the place of the skull, because of the stone fixture, not fixtures, but the stones naturally in the area on these. And you would notice, and this is just an example, obviously they're not going to be able to pinpoint. There's all kinds of discussions about where certain things happen historically in Jerusalem, and it's hard to make heads or tails out of a lot of it. So this is a representation of the kind of imagery they would have been looking at. And certainly, notice it would be in a position, this is a modern picture, but it would be in a position where it would be public and seen. And so you can kind of get that imagery of how they would take him to a place like this, the place of the skull, Golgotha, or in Latin, Calvary. Well, our English version of the Latin word, Calvary, which may be transliterated. I'd have to think about that.
I would think, like the temple being split, everything that you would, okay, this really was it. I mean, you think somebody would.
Yeah. When all this evidence eventually mounts, especially at his death, it's amazing what they were willing to ignore. And we'll talk more about that as we move forward. But you can just kind of imagine this walk. And so as they head to Golgotha, to Calvary, to crucify him, on the way, they offer him or gave him to drink wine mingled with myrrh. Trying to remember which writer says mingled with gall. This is the first attempt. One record shows that he tastes, realizes what it is, and rejects. Mark just basically says he rejects it. And here's what I want to just recognize with you here. So, as best I can understand, what they're offering him is mingled with things that would basically act like sedatives. They would lessen the immense misery of what he was about to experience. And from historical documentation, it appears that this was common. That though the Romans and those soldiers may have just unimagined cruelty in their minds, there were some people that would place themselves along the road who had compassion upon these men who were about, and would offer this wine mingled with gall or mingled with myrrh, and it could be used in such a way to sedate or to lessen the pain and the misery of what was about to be experienced. And here's the point I wanted to make. Jesus rejects that. And in essence, because he's drinking the cup of his Father. And the plan this week, he's not going to deaden his senses as he is experiencing the cruelty of this death. He's not going to lessen it or avoid any of it. He's absorbing every aspect of every ounce of the cruelty that they're offering to him. And when he even has an opportunity to take something that would aid it or make it less or just deaden the pain a little bit and the agony that he's gone through, no. Rejects it and refuses to accept that from them. He's going to experience every aspect of this scene in its fullness for us.
Wouldn't that also quicken the death because you're going to be so relaxed to just,
potentially, as it relates. So when they had crucified him, they parted his garments, taking them back now, casting lots upon them what every man should take. And so kind of a last insult. They basically take the last what? The last possessions the last thing that you have upon earth. The clothes literally on your back. And they take those. A last insult in relationship to Jesus. And Mark records, and it was the third hour, and they crucified him. there are some things we could look into a little bit with that. There is somewhat of a difficulty, because if you go over to John's account, John says it was about the 6th hour of the day. And Mark records it is the 3rd hour of the day. Now, just a little bit of knowledge, when you're talking about, and you may already know this, but Jewish time was basically based on sun up, 6 o'clock in the morning, sundown, 6 o'clock at night, and they base everything on that. So first hour of the day is 6, second hour is 7, third hour, right? No, 6, 7, yeah. Clear through though. So not just a particular moment in time, but it's the whole of that time. Because they're not rendering things by minutes. And they're not rendering things in the same level of precision that we do. John just says it's about the 6th hour. John may be dealing with when all of these things kind of ultimately end, because I believe all of them record that it is at that point that the darkness falls, it is finished, those kind of things, begin to process all of that. Ultimately, in the 9th hour, you'll see all of them kind of record the same thing. So I don't see a challenge here in terms of time. Mark just records in his record, this is the moment. He doesn't necessarily tell us which of these precise moments. He's kind of throwing all of it into the crucifixion process. He could have been dealing with when all of this started back here, when they begin to scourge him and they begin to mock him, and up until they get him to Golgotha. There doesn't seem to be a great concern about trying to say this is the exact moment that this or this or this happened. It's a relevant term to help us just appreciate the general idea of when these things are occurring. So all night long, the trial, the mock trial, the miseries, the challenges that Jesus has been experienced, from one high priest to the next high priest, to one Roman ruler to another Roman ruler, back to Pilate. And so then the gathering of people, crucified. And so you've done all of that all night and then into the early morning, and now you're about to the 3rd hour of the day, and this process begins. And the sadness of the crucifixion begins to occur.
Brian, I don't need to go back. There was one thing I didn't mention back there. Just every time I read it, it just floors me. I think, as Pilate said, "I'm innocent of just of the blood of this just person. See to it." Yeah. And those people said, "His blood be upon us and our children."
Yeah.
Can you imagine a statement like that? What hatred they had to have in their hearts to push some kind of a curse or condemnation upon generations to come.
Yeah. And then when Judas wanted them to own up to that very statement, they wouldn't do it. They make the vow to Pilate just to get him to send him to the cross. But when Judas takes the money back, they're like, "That's blood money. We don't have any part in that." So his blood be on our heads and on our children. Not really, because they wouldn't own up to it when Judas came. So the superscription of his accusation was written over the King of the Jews. Other texts illustrate that happened in 3 different languages as they describe that and place that above Jesus. And as I understand it, that would be typical. That the charge, the reason why someone was being crucified would be evident before the public. And it's interesting that his superscription has solely to do with what they accused him of claiming, which isn't necessarily accurate in its truest senses. And no intention of ever being a king over an earthly Jewish nation. Never did he ever describe himself as that kind of king. But that's what the Romans felt enough legal issue about, that he claims to be a king. We can't have any other king but Rome. And so that's the inscription or the superscription placed above him, indicating what he had done in their eyes to be worthy of this.
They decided that was the charge that they were going to carry before him, and
Well, from the Jews to them. But the Romans can't use blasphemy against the God they don't believe in as a legal charge to put him on a cross. So they have to have something else. And so they come to this. Yeah.
The Jews tried to get him to change that on their cross too. And he wouldn't do it. He said, what I've written, I've written.
Yeah. It's almost Pilate's way of one last little, I didn't want to deal with this anyway. And you want him crucified, I did that, but here, this is what I'm putting above him.
Coming from Pilate, from the Romans too, that was derision toward the Jews themselves.
Yeah.
Something that they didn't want to admit.
Right.
There's the I am again.
Yeah. Right back to it. So with him they crucify two thieves, the one on his right hand, the other on his left. And the scripture was fulfilled, which saith, and he was numbered with the transgressors. And I believe that's in Isaiah 53:12, if you look that up. He is numbered with the transgressors. The only innocent man to walk the earth is now being numbered among common thieves and criminals and being treated as such. And so, as the passers-by, they railed on him, wagging their heads and saying, "Ah, thou that destroyest the temple and buildest it in 3 days, save thyself and come down from the cross." Now, I'm not excusing their behavior in any shape or form. But remember that most of what Jesus did happened where? Up by, in and around the Sea of Galilee. So most of the information you have, if you're in Jerusalem, came through what? What others had said about him, right? And so you've been hearing all along about this Jesus of Nazareth, who goes around helping blind people see, lame people walk. He's able to feed thousands with nothing. All you have heard is all these, in your mind, potentially fantastical, just unbelievable stories, right? And now here he is upon a cross. And you look up and you just shake your head and go, you're supposed to be someone who has the power and ability to do all these things, and you can't even save yourself. You were supposed to be able to perform all these things, and you can't. And the meekness of Jesus on the cross is amazing to me. Power under control, right? That's kind of the way we talk about being meek. Power under control. You want to talk about power under control, there you have it. We saw it in the garden when he could have called what? Angels down. And he refrained. You've seen every step of the way. And now here he is. The passers-by railing, joking, laughing, railing on him, saying you're supposed to be some great powerful man. Save yourself. You're the one that said, aren't you the one that said you could destroy the temple and build it back in 3 days? And you can't even save yourself. Come on down from the cross. I mean, I again, wrapping your mind around all of it is just almost too deep to even fathom. He's suffering the shame and the misery and the agony of the cross. He has refused the what little bit of comfort that could have come to him by drinking that wine mingled with gall. And now those who are walking by are here he is, hanging, and they're mocking as they walk by. The chief priests mocking said among themselves with the scribes, he saved others, himself he cannot save. It's amazing that they would reach such levels that they would just pass by and say such things. And the chief priests, almost self-satisfied as they walk by, and he saved others, but himself he can't do anything about. Let Christ, the King of Israel, descend now from the cross, that we may see and believe, and that and they that were crucified with him reviled him. We know that from other contexts that one of those has a change of heart, but initially, both of these men that were crucified with him began to revile against him as well. And it's interesting. Let Christ, the King of Israel, descend now from the cross, that we may see and believe. What utter hypocrisy and unimaginable lie, because they had already witnessed what? And had access to knowledge about what? They had plenty. They'd already had plenty. And then add the fact, fast forward in the history for just a half a second, but ultimately, what's the greatest evidence of the power of Jesus going to be? His resurrection. And did they believe that? No, not for the most part. It's just unthinkable the way they're reacting to all this.
Yeah, I'm convinced they would not believe even if he had come down from the cross in front of them. Just for what you said, because when he was raised, they didn't believe. I mean, you almost get that with the rich man and Lazarus.
Yeah.
You know, when the rich man says, "Send Lazarus back," and Abraham says, "Well, they have Moses and the prophets. They have the scripture."
Yeah.
He says, "No, but if one comes back from the dead," he said, "if they don't believe the scriptures, they're not going to believe even if one rose from the dead."
Yeah. And verse 33 has always struck me as just, I don't know how anybody could have experienced this and not have any reaction to it. When the 6th hour was come, there was darkness over the whole land until the 9th hour. So from 3 o'clock until 6 o'clock. Is that right? Am I doing the math right? Noon. Yeah, I'm sorry. Noon to 3. They from what normally is the brightest time of the day, darkness, and it doesn't move them. To me, within that first hour, I'm thinking we better get him off that cross. You know, if I'm part of this, and it's been dark for quite a while, and it's not supposed to be dark, I feel like I'm reacting to that, but apparently not them. They're unfazed by darkness from noon to 3. Then at the 9th hour, he cries out with a loud voice, saying, "Eloi, Eloi," or "Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani," which is being interpreted, my, why hast thou forsaken me?" Which is more of a direct quote from Psalm 22. If you go back and look, that concept of my, why hast thou forsaken me?
That verse says that Christ did not die the ordinary death on the cross. Those people were crucified through long hours of agony, go into unconsciousness and die. And he let out a loud voice and cried.
Yeah.
So,
Conscious to the end.
for that is, like you said, the power yet in him.
Yeah.
And maybe also it's a visiting at the actual time when he died to everybody.
And just imagine how difficult it would have been to do this from the cross. People eventually suffocated to death because the weight of the body pulled on the lungs, and in order to get a breath, you had to pull yourself up. And there's so many things that would have caused so much pain to shoot through his body just in speaking these words.
And we'll get to that. Lord willing, on Sunday when we see more of this.